Hey, good morning, class. Hopefully, you guys are doing well. I hope you guys had a great New Year. Hope you had an awesome Christmas. Sorry I'm not there right now. I'm obviously at home with my new baby. At this point, when I'm recording this, I don't know if I've had a boy or a girl yet, but that will be happening in a few days. And then I will be sending out some pictures because I know some of you guys are interested. But we're going to move forward and we're going to take the last set of notes for the class. We have one little unit that we're going to cover. It's on Chapter 8 on something called ATP. And we're going to deal with this molecule that is really our energy. Because as we know, as we've talked about before, we need energy in order to survive. It's one of the 8 characteristics of life that organisms need to need and obtain this energy in order to carry out its life functions. And we know that we can gain energy by eating things, and that's how the whole food chain happens, and energy is passed on from one trophic level to the next through that food chain as organisms start eating other organisms. But really, what is it that we're using in order to carry out those life functions? It's not just the food that we eat, it's actually some other molecule. So today we're going to talk about the energy for life. And remember that every organism requires energy for biological work to carry out our life functions. So what does it mean to be biological work? Remember when we talked about active transport, going up that hill, moving things across that cell membrane that need energy to do that. All right? Exocytosis is one of the examples, a protein pump that's pumping things across the membrane that doesn't go from high to low. We're going from a low concentration to a high concentration. That's active transport. We haven't really talked too much about photosynthesis in depth, but we know that photosynthesis happens. We know that photosynthesis is necessary for plants to take on the sun's energy to create energy for us as we eat it, right? They're creating not only oxygen, but they're creating those high energy starches and sugars, those carbohydrates that we're able to benefit from. We haven't really talked too much about mitosis, but that is biological work. That is the splitting of our cells, essentially. You know, how do we get new cells? It's through that process of mitosis. And we spent a little bit of time talking about proteins, and then why they're made and how they're made is called protein synthesis. And remember that DNA has the instructions for making those proteins. Now, if I'm going too fast through this, please feel free to pause it, to stop, rewind. You can rewatch. And it's also posted online, so you can go on my website and watch it as well. So those are some things that are, that help us carry out life functions, right? That's biological work. Active transport, photosynthesis, mitosis, protein synthesis. That's just to name a very few things that include biological work. So we mentioned before that energy has to come from the food that we eat. Essentially, it's glucose. Remember C6H12O6. Glucose is a molecule that we use to create this energy. Autotrophs actually produce their own glucose, right? They're producers. They produce their own glucose or their food. They use it, and then we eat it, and we gain it from them. And they do this by the process of photosynthesis. Notice that if you use PS, that's a way to shorten photosynthesis, because I know it's a long word. So energy for making the glucose molecules come from the actual sun, which is ultimately the source of energy for all or most organisms on this earth. We know that not all energy comes from the sun. Some come in the form of chemical energy where sun does not shine. There are bacteria that will go through that process of chemosynthesis. But what we're going to be going into is photosynthesis, and that's what we're going to talk more about. So that's why I'm saying that the energy comes from the sun. Now, remember that we are consumers. We are heterotrophs. These are organisms that cannot produce their own food. What we have to do is we have to ingest that glucose, and that glucose is then broken down in the mitochondria. You probably know the mitochondria as the powerhouse of the cell. The mitochondria is used to help make this energy molecule called ATP. And that mitochondria is that bean-shaped organelle that's inside of our cells, and we have lots of them, especially in like our muscle cells. The ones that are going to use a lot of energy. And the process that they use in order to make that ATP molecule is called cellular respiration. Excuse me. Cellular respiration is a process of breaking down glucose to make ATP, that energy molecule, in organisms. So remember that respiration is just breathing. That's not the same thing as what I'm talking about as cellular respiration. Yes, we're going to need the oxygen that we breathe in, and we're going to take in that glucose, and we're going to make ATP from it. We will be talking about cellular respiration in more detail next semester. So let's go back to that ATP molecule. It's called adenosine triphosphate. It's actually compared to like a fully charged battery. Think of your cell phone. When we all love it when we're at 100%. That we have 100% of our energy that can do a lot of work. Right? That's ATP, a fully charged battery. And that ATP molecule is composed of 3 parts. It's composed of that amino acid, adenine. It has a ribose, a sugar in it. So it's an amino acid, a sugar, and adenosine triphosphate. It has 3 phosphate groups. So adenine, ribose, and 3 phosphate groups make up an ATP molecule. And one day, probably tomorrow, you will be making your own ATP molecule. As you can see in the picture here, we have adenine, ribose is that 5-carbon sugar, and 3 phosphates on that little tail end. And those phosphates are very important because energy is stored in that phosphate bond of that ATP molecule. When one of those phosphates are released, energy then is released that we can use to do biological work. Now, we're not going to get too crazy in terms of what forms bonds between the phosphate molecules, but there are things called electrons. I'm sure you've heard of electrons before. You'll talk more about them in chemistry class, but electrons do form bonds between molecules, between compounds, between elements. And those little red things whipping around the nucleus there are supposed to be showing you electrons. So when that phosphate bond is broken, energy is released, as I mentioned. And we get this thing called ADP. Very similar to ATP, adenosine triphosphate. ADP is adenosine diphosphate. Diphosphate is going to be 2 phosphates now. And you can see in this picture, we have 3 phosphates here. It's going to get converted to ADP. Energy is released. And we're able to use that energy to do biological work. So now we have adenosine diphosphate. Di meaning two. It differs from ATP because there's only two phosphates, tri and di. And it can be compared to a lower charged battery, just like your cell phone. When your cell phone's, reaches that 20% or 10%, it says low energy, your phone can't do as much, or you're afraid to use it because you don't want to run out of all the energy that it does have left. So we say that it is a partially charged or low charged battery. So all we have to do is add on another phosphate to charge that battery back up. It's like plugging your phone in. So we have ADP going to ATP. If we add that extra phosphate molecule here, we'll be able to get ATP. And there's this cycle that happens within our cells as our cells use up an ATP molecule. They don't actually use it up. They just take that phosphate off. It gets some energy to do the biological work. And then the ADP molecules can get recharged by just plugging it in or adding on another phosphate. And there's a continuous cycle that goes around in all of our cells, in all organisms, that as ATP changes to ADP, ADP can change back into ATP with a certain process, and therefore we can keep that energy molecule going in our cells and keeping it charged. So as I was saying, ADP can be recharged back to ATP by adding back that third phosphate. It's like recharging your battery. Obviously, if you have three phosphoruses or three phosphate groups added on, you're going to be very happy. If you have two, not so happy. Wah, wah, wah. Just like when your phone is dead, you're not so happy. But when your phone's 100%, you're like, yay! And you're all happy. So ATP is really the only molecule that is a usable form of energy within our cell. We can eat all the glucose we want, we can eat all the sugars we want, but we're not going to get energy unless our body takes that glucose and makes ATP with it. So all of the food that you eat must be converted to ATP. And glucose is the one that is most easily converted to the ATP molecule. Or I should say ATP molecules. You get a lot of molecules of ATP from a glucose. So, fun fact, our body will use 1 billion ATP per minute. So as you're sitting here, you're using billions and billions of ATP molecules just to carry out your life functions within your body. Just think of one class period, you're using 58 billion ATP molecules. So in order to keep up with the billion of ATP molecules that you use per minute, you should consume about 18 to 2,500 calories every day. And now it all depends on your size and weight and so forth of how many calories you should actually intake, but you should not exceed 2,500 calories, or generally you shouldn't be under 1,800 calories. And different foods have different amounts of energy. We get energy from the foods that we eat, as we've noted. So which organic compound, think of those proteins, carbs, lipids, which one is going to have the most energy per gram? Not necessarily which one's the best for you to eat, but which one is the one that's going to give you the most energy. Well, carbohydrates will give you about 4 calories per gram of carbohydrate. Proteins will also give you about 4 calories per gram. And lipids, or fats, will give you 9 calories per gram. So you actually get the most calories, which will give you the most energy from fats. But obviously, having too many fats in your diet is not a good thing as well. And how many calories do you think water will have? Well, hopefully you're all saying 0, 0, 0, because water doesn't have carbohydrates, proteins, or fats in it. Water has no calories whatsoever. All right, and that is it. So what we have learned about ATP and how it changes to ADP and what makes up the ATP molecule and what the ATP molecule does, and all the things in this set of notes. Will be on a little quiz this week. You will be responsible to know the material, and this material will also be on your final exam, which will be in a couple weeks. If you have any questions, comments, concerns that somebody couldn't answer, I'm hoping Mrs. Latona or Mr. Lorraine will come in either first or second hour throughout the week to help you guys out to answer any questions. But if you guys have any other questions, please feel free to email me. I will do my best to respond and to get you the answers that you need. Good luck, and I hope you guys have a great couple weeks, and I will be back shortly. Take care, guys.